Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm professor of philosophy and environmental studies here at Gonzaga, where I direct the Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. You might notice that we have a new name or are transitioning between names. We've recently been approved as part of the university's new strategic plan that the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment is becoming the Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment, and this is the first event that we're hosting under that new name. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. As you know, we have a really great talk, but before we get too much farther, we should remind ourselves that we are on the ancestral lands of the Spokane tribal people. As many of the tribes in this area were really instrumental in drawing the Jesuit priests to this area to start Gonzaga. It's always important to remind ourselves that we wouldn't exist as an institution were not for having been invited to this region. Sometimes we've been a good neighbor, other times we could have done a better job, and so we should always start by centering ourselves and reminding us of the obligations we have to the communities that preceded us. The next event, the last of our lecture series for this semester, is 2 weeks from today here in this room and live streaming online. It's a panel discussion with 2 attorneys from the Western Environmental Law Center, as well as my colleague, Dr. Greg Gordon from the Environmental Studies and Sciences Department, on the question, can we solve the climate crisis and protect wild spaces at the same time? Or is there some tension inherent in trying to do both of those together? If you're on our email list, you might also know that we just launched and announced what we'll be hosting for the spring. It's a really exciting series of events that we hope that you'll register for, whether attending here in the Hemmingson Auditorium on campus or joining us online from wherever you find yourself in the world. The first talk will be with the founder of Roast House, Deb DiBernardo, on sustainable commodities on the 23rd of January. Then we're going to have really interesting panel discussion with 2 attorneys, again from WELC, on Montana v. Held, which was a youth-led litigation, which was successful in Montana, suing the federal government, or the state government, excuse me, advocating for climate action. We're hoping, fingers crossed, we might have some of the plaintiffs, the youth plaintiffs, join us for that. Then on the 20th, we'll have a screening of the movie, the documentary Covenant of the Salmon People, which should be excellent here, again, in this space. On March 4th, we're going to have Dr. Dan Vimont from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's a climate scientist, talking about a community-building approach to understanding climate change impacts. Should be a really excellent piece of sort of connecting of climate science and organization, and reflecting a little bit on his experience as a Jesuit-educated scientist himself. Then on the 4th of April, we'll be hosting an event with a number of colleagues and collaborators, including the U.S. Attorney for Eastern Washington, Vanessa Waldreff, the Attorney General's Office of Washington State, and our colleagues at the law school at their Center for Commerce Ethics will be hosting an event celebrating the 50th anniversary of Expo 74. Some of you might know that Spokane 50 years ago hosted an environmentally themed World Fair. We'll be celebrating that, the city and many others will be celebrating all sorts of events that summer. We'll be hosting a day-long conference on environmental justice, what we've done in the last 50 years and what the next 50 years has in store for us all day on April 4th at the law school. And then finally, at the end of the semester, we'll be hosting another screening of the documentary Without Them I Am Lost, which is by Dr. Charles Pepitone here from Gonzaga University, who's the director of that, and we'll be having a discussion afterwards. So we hope you'll register for some of those events and attend. As you know, these take quite a few resources to plan, and we have a lot of other activities that we're doing. And so if you have the means to help us to achieve, expand, and continue hosting these events, I would please encourage you to do so. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. And so our speaker is Dr. Deb L. Morrison, who works at the intersection of justice, climate science, and learning. She's a climate and anti-oppression activist, a scientist, learning scientist, an educator, mother, a locally elected official, and many other things. Deb works in research practice policy partnerships from local community to international scale. She works to iteratively understand complex socio-ecological systems through design-based and action-oriented research, while at the same time seeking to improve human-environment relations and sustainability. Dr. Morrison draws on an eclectic range of justice theory to inform her work in the world and to foster her continued journey for transformative liberation. She's a really well-published author on diverse topics that intersect with climate justice and continues to foster collaborative writing partnerships across disciplines and communities that have historically been disconnected. My colleague Carly Holmbein and I have the pleasure of collaborating with her on the Climb Time Network, which is a Washington state-funded climate education partnership. And so the idea of inviting her here to talk about the future of climate science education in the United States seemed like a really natural topic for her to be sort of invited to imagine what that might look like in the future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Deb Morrison.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It was interesting when Brian and Carly suggested the future of climate change in America as a topic. I was like, well, that's not too big of a topic at all, is it? So hopefully I can help to a great degree understand some of that space and to contextualize it in the global landscape of climate change education and learning. All right. So before we get started, I actually want to just acknowledge, as Brian acknowledged place, I'd like to acknowledge community. The work that I'm going to share with you tonight at all scales is deeply collaborative. And these are just a few of the colleagues who have greatly influenced my own learning and are partnered with me in many different ways. And as you can see, the Climb Time Partnership, the Access Partnership, ACE, which we'll get into in a minute, and the CLACHASE partners, those four things alone are hundreds of people involved in those efforts. So a grateful acknowledgement and humility to the learning that I continue to do in those efforts. So let's think about America for a second. Let's start with America. And often when we think about climate change in America, we dive straight into states, boundaries, but that's not how America is in the world, right? It sits on a round ball floating in space, a finite round ball. And as we start to think about what we need to know to be able to engage in climate action, we have to really think about that positioning of America, socio-political positioning and historical positioning. So as we dive into different pieces of this work, everything that I talk to you about is going to be grounded in issues of climate justice. And we're going to unpack that a little bit too, because climate justice itself is a very complex topic that is contextual in nature. When I say climate justice here in Spokane, it's very different than when I say climate justice in Bangladesh. And so one of the things that I encourage everyone to do as their own justice commitments to this work is to dig into the Bali, 2002 Bali Principles of Climate Justice, and make yourself really familiar with the diverse ways in which climate justice has been defined by the justice community, those most marginalized historically and currently, and for the future of humanity. So I have linked the Bali resources, and all of my slides will be available, so you don't need to take mad notes. You can listen to the story I'm going to unfold for you. But I've linked those. I've also linked, because some of our sort of practices of publication really do carry weight in the world, in particular power ways. I just wanted to link to a particular paper and the related report. So the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report for the first time named colonialism as a problem related to that climate change was related to colonialism. Anthropogenic climate change is related to colonialism. That was groundbreaking. And there is a number of different efforts underway with indigenous scientists to actually deepen that understanding with the IPCC. All right, so I'm going to take us into education in a familiar way to you. Everybody has been through some form of learning in their youth, whether it's formal schooling or informal education. And currently, we hear a lot from the youth movement about their desire for understanding and engaging in climate learning. So we hear people on strike in Portland, the Montana case that was just mentioned. We hear about skills, job training for green futures. There are many different arguments that are being made Really dive into those that resonate with your own context. Again, things are very contextual. So really dive into what is motivating your local folks in terms of understanding climate change learning in this context, because that's going to help you tune to what it is that we need to learn as a society in any given place. There are some international level surveys that have been done to try and understand what are some general principles. So UNESCO, which is largely responsible for K-12 education at least, there's about 14 different agencies of the UN that are involved in learning in some way. But UNESCO is primarily involved with K-12 learning. UNESCO surveyed students and found that 70% of youth globally felt that they didn't understand climate change well, that they couldn't explain how to engage in climate action, and were really wanting some form of climate learning in their formal schooling systems. At the same time that statistic is there, it's parallel to a statistic that nearly half of countries do not have climate change education standards or intents currently. And those that do don't necessarily have any implementation of those efforts. All this to say that there is a global similarity to what's going on in the US, but we will see some differences here in a second. There was a study done by a collaboration. It was in The Lancet. It was done in 2021, and it involved people from Finland, from the US, from Britain, all over the place. And they took a number of countries, surveyed them around climate anxiety. So as you can understand, if you don't know about climate change, if you're unsure what to do in the future, if you have no pathway to really coherent learning around that, you're probably anxious, given the world today. And so anxiety was high in almost every situation. And the US, which is at the very bottom of this list, is actually quite similar to other countries. You can see here that some countries like India or the Philippines are much higher. And when you think about that, you can understand the sort of nature of climate fragility that some countries have in different contexts due to high poverty, low resources, and high impacts. So there's a little bit of brittleness to the systems. So not knowing about climate change has lived realities for many more people in those contexts. Don't be confused. There are lived realities for people right here in the United States every day for not being able to learn and act related to climate change. All right, so there is, as far as I can tell, and I know the literature fairly well, one study that actually makes the connection between climate change learning and behavioral changes, like in a very direct way. Lots more research is in the publication pipeline right now. But this study was done on a university course in 2020. So there's likely a few out there I haven't caught in the last 3 years. But this study was done in 2020 with a university course in San Jose University in California. And what they did in this situation was they followed a cohort of students. There was 500 university undergraduate students who had taken this year-long course, and then they tracked them for 5 years. That's a very difficult study. Okay, and so it's a longitudinal study, and they tracked them for 5 years, and then they asked them questions about their behaviors, how their behaviors were changing. And so they were actually able to see that people that took the year-long sequence of course, their behavior was changing. Okay, that type of research is badly needed because policymakers often don't understand the connection between learning and climate science and climate action in the world, all right? However, in 1992, the UNFCCC, lots of C's in this area of the world, so in 1992, when the UN Convention for UN Framework Convention for Climate Change was created, they specified in that convention that learning was a critical part of climate mobilization. And they specified it through 6 different items. They named education specifically, training, which they talked about as vocational and professional learning, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, and international coordination. Until 2015, there was almost no financial resources put toward this Article 6 component of the UNFCCC. In 2015, with the Paris Agreement, it became Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, which confused everyone, because Article 6 is now about financing. So in the Paris Agreement, all the nations that signed the Paris Agreement agreed again that these 6 elements were critical to climate mobilization. But people were unsure. And the challenge here is that when you're talking about climate change work, a lot of the people who are in the decision-making spaces are scientists and policymakers, but not educators or learning designers. And so we have a bit of a disconnect. Even communications folks are a little bit on the fringe of a lot of the policymaking space. That is changing now, but that has historically been the situation. So in 2021, the new Action for Climate Empowerment program, it's called the Glasgow Work Program, was created. And there had been a 10-year program to try and get climate empowerment on the table, which loosely speaking is climate learning for action, okay? They tried to get these 6 elements on the table, get funding behind them, get the program moving. So the UN was working quite hard to do this. I was deeply involved in the negotiations leading up to and following the Glasgow work program effort, and it involved an international constellation of climate activists who worked tirelessly to influence the negotiators from key countries around the world. And we were able to get justice named inside the Glasgow work program, which is critical because while countries may not fund everything, we can now go to philanthropic organizations, international organizations. We can leverage the language and sit, and we have something to sit on to say that this is an important mechanism for learning and for mobilization. So sometimes we talk about climate change and we don't use the words climate change. Sometimes we talk about sustainability. For decades now, there has been work on education for sustainable development. Most of the first world has ignored that work. It has been going on in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. And the framework that came out in 2020 with UNESCO again, created this framework called Education for Sustainable Development, is brilliant. It talks about our human life, our human activity, and it names the different components of how learning connects to all these different places, and that all of this is interconnected through these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Over here, number 13 on the far side, is climate action. So they actually named climate action in the wheel. They also named education, number 4. So we see that education and climate action are in this idea of sustainability, and actually you could use them as an overarching framework to mobilize the entire wheel. Okay, so that is a little bit of the sort of policy framework history. Now the real history, okay? It's messy. It's messy. There's a lot of different people, different cultural norms, different communities who have been deeply involved in climate learning in some way. Because climate learning impacts every aspect of our life, okay? So as people have started to realize, especially since the Paris Agreement, that climate education might be a focal point for broader society climate learning, more and more people are wading into the space. I do want to acknowledge that much of the sound pedagogy that you're starting to see in research studies has been in play since time immemorial. Indigenous pedagogies that underlie a lot of what is being currently published were grounded in many tribal and First Nations communities globally. And if you look on the far side of the slide here, there is now something called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. And that platform is directly controlled by Indigenous nations from around the world and is facilitated by the United Nations. So Indigenous nations have a deep challenge in the UN programs because they themselves are not a country. And so to be able to work through that problem, the UN created what's called the LCIPP. And that hosts, through an elected process around the world, Indigenous peoples and their knowledges into the UN system. And so there is an entire platform for sharing Indigenous knowledge, including curriculum and resources in that space. There's an incredible amount of work being done in North America and in the US specifically. So we have things like the Climate Justice Alliance, the NAACP. They're all working in different ways around issues of justice and learning. Many of them have been working in their own communities, not necessarily working broadly in educational systems. And that has to do with cultural longevity, cultural resurgence, because so much of the colonial project was to erase knowledge systems. And so many, many tribal nations in the United States worked more insularly with their own communities to regain language, to regain knowledge, to do that work. But they are incredible knowledge holders for us all as we go forward. We also have folks like FEE. So FEE is the Federation for Environmental Education. It's an international group. You might be familiar with Green Schools. That's a US version of FEE. And they've been working for creating schools themselves that are sustainable. So infrastructure that's sustainable in schools. They've been coordinating a lot over the years with folks like NAAEE, which is acronyms, education's full of acronyms, North American Association for Environmental Education. And that movement has been really working in the after-school or out-of-school outdoor education space a lot. Not fully, but a lot of it. And so all of those histories and trajectories are coming together with knowledge bases in research fields. Things like the National Academy's report on climate change education for in K-14, I think it was, yeah, K-14 settings, and with the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards, which is the framework for K-12 science education. The framework came out in 2012 for the United States. It was the first time in a science education document in the United States that climate change was specifically stated as a learning goal. So prior to 2012, climate change was not explicitly stated in national education, not science standards. I'm not actually 100% sure when the social studies ones kicked in. But there is a social studies framework as well that's also been like moving along in different ways. I want to say that might have actually preceded, I think it was 2008, the C3 social studies standards came out. And so we have all of these different pieces moving inside schools, and educators and administrators and leaders in education systems have to make sense of it, okay? To be able to meet that need that we have for fostering climate learning, okay? So as we think about that, who's making sense of it? Who's doing that work? Who's pulling all these pieces together? Largely, it's in the hands of teachers up until now, okay? Teachers have been working, in many of them for the last decade or two, in isolation. In the last 5 to 10 years, they've been getting a lot more support. But, you know, teachers have been challenged. And in the US, for political reasons largely, not political reasons, political rhetoric reasons, I would say, have been really challenged to engage in climate change learning. But even when you look at sustainability teaching, if you don't use the word climate change and you look at sustainability, the US has also struggled to engage in sustainability learning in classrooms. A lot of that is because climate science itself is under attack in the United States in different ways. All of these challenges are what's often referred to in education systems as the culture wars of school, okay? In 2000, before 2000, climate change was apolitical. The Bush Sr. talked about climate change. And so at 2000 and on is when you start to get the challenges. And there are a number of reasons that we can talk about more deeply. Gallup got together with the Smithsonian and did a study on an international study looking at teachers and the supports that they needed. And the US constantly had a situation where educators felt unsupported, under-resourced, and did not teach these topics. Some of them talked about professional learning opportunities. Others just were worried about teaching climate change in different contexts. That report is really interesting to read. Again, all of these are linked in the slides and resources, so do dive into it. When you look at the Smithsonian study, you can also, they break down something I thought was very interesting. They look at teachers and US administrators. So now they're not talking just about teachers, they're talking about administrators. And so while teachers might be nervous about teaching or not getting the sort of support they need to incorporate sustainability topics, administrators feel a little more secure, but somehow that's not getting passed through to teachers. So there's something in the system that's not working well to support climate change learning. And when we think about this across countries, the dark blue bar here is the United States, the first bar. And you can see that some of the reasons are, so teachers think it's equally important in the US as in other places. That's the first couple bars. But they don't feel like they have the knowledge, and they don't feel like they have the time to teach those topics. So those are the main reasons that they're giving. All right, so I think one of the challenges that we face in the United States when we think about the future of climate change education in the United States is we actually have to ask ourselves a very foundational question. Why are you teaching, right? What is it that the educational system is doing for us as a society? And I have my answers, you might have your answers, and it's going to be highly variable depending who you ask and what they understand that job to be. Many, many people right now in the US policy space in education think that climate change education is to help produce people to engage in jobs that are to do with sustainable transitions, green transitions, and green futures. It's a jobs discussion, okay? How you might design learning, if your answer to this question is to get people jobs, is going to be very different than if your answer to this question is, I want to remedy environment and climate injustices in the US, okay? So understanding your answer to this question is going to really help you think about what climate justice learning is. There's a little precursor. I think climate change learning is climate justice learning. So we'll dive into that one. All right, so a huge shout out here to Dr. Kelsey Fowler and Dr. Phil Bell, who I work with at the Institute for Science and Math Education. This is a collaborative group think, this model. We have not published on it, and we're slowly starting to get our head around how we would discuss it. Because climate justice education, which is how we think of climate change education, brings together many, many different fields of learning, from climate science to climate change to sustainability to justice work, and weaves it together in a way that we can help support a system of climate change education. So as you can see, there are many different sort of petals to this plant that we hope to grow. And if you look on the inner white circle, one of the core things that we try to center our work around is these three basic questions. What are we teaching? How are we teaching it? And who's involved in the learning design? Okay? Not just who are we teaching, but who's involved in actually designing the learning? Okay? And so when we think about this justice-grounded model for climate change, this is the future. This is the merge of the group think currently in America about where we could go for climate change education. Incredible work is being done right now here in Washington State by Dr. Megan Bang, Dr. Carrie Zoe, and many of their colleagues. They worked originally with Seattle Public Schools, and now they're replicating their work in 3 or 4 states across the nation to see how it looks as you move it. This work is grounded in Indigenous pedagogy, and it works with young children, primary school children, to think about learning in the context of place, learning intergenerationally, So we actually build these mentorships and relationships, caring about the environment, so ecological caring, and developing that systems thinking perspective. And so this work has resources for educators. It's heavy resource laden effort because they worked with educators, including administrators, to help think about how do we support teachers to do the work in classrooms, how do we work with families and communities to define and be involved in the learning, how do we actually break the mold of schooling so it's not destructive for Indigenous communities, but it's actually culturally resurgent in nature. So, and the other thing that they did, which I love, I'm a forest ecologist by training, is they really talked about how do we get kids outside? How do we break the school wall? How do we bring outside community and space in? And how do we take kids out? Because that builds those socio-ecological relationships that are so critical to resilience in shifting climate work. We also, myself and Dr. Bell wrote or co-edited an issue of Connected Science Learning a few years back. And we reached out to colleagues across the nation to provide examples of what their learning looks like. So in this effort, I think we had 5 examples of different grade bands and what climate learning looked like in different places. So this is also a great set of easy to read articles that are online and freely available. Just to kind of think about, like, what does it look like when we engage? So I want to paint you a little bit of story, okay? What does climate justice learning look like in practice? We've got a fancy little model with lots of petals, but what does it actually look like, all right? So I'm going to take something that is core to everyone, all right? Life on Earth needs water, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to think about this question. It's going to be our organizing question in different contexts. How does water impact your life? And we can think about that in a number of different settings. We can think about how we could engage in this question. So I want you to just take a moment, and I want you to think for yourself, how does water impact your life? All right. When I was young and I went through school, I learned about the water cycle. And it was very abstracted, had a lot of pipes and looked very industrial, and the diagrams in the textbook. And that's what I learned, all right? One of the things that we want to learn when we think about climate change education is we actually want systems thinkers. We want people who can put their learning into a big picture system and add to it as they go through their learning throughout their life. We also want folks to understand the nature of science, because science itself is often debated. But what is scientific uncertainty versus we don't know something? Those things are very different. And so being able to understand the nature of science is actually critical to being able to have a society that engages democratically in effective climate decision making. I think it's Sweden did a huge critical thinking effort in their school system like 20 years ago, and they don't have a lot of debate internally about climate because they have as long as people are rational and provide evidence and reasoning, it's a lot easier to have civic conversation about climate options. So when we think about how does water impact your life, I lived in Colorado for 16 years. Glaciers are critical to water in Colorado. Critical to flooding, to drought, to the cycles of water supply in cities, and to the Colorado River Compact policy issues that were just renegotiated or just in the process of being renegotiated at the moment. So how water gets distributed from the headwaters of the Colorado River all the way to Mexico. And so it's an international issue when you start looking at pictures like this and examining data. Young children can look at photo pairs like this and make inferences about what's going on in data. So these are a time-paired sequence of photographs of the same location, 1958 and 2003. The USGS and NOAA have a huge number of photo pairs like this for different locations around the country. So you can look at some place close to you and actually give students examples of this. And then ask questions like, what might happen to our water in the spring when there's lots of melt off a glacier? You know, what's causing it to retreat? We can ask science questions. We can ask, you know, policy questions about like, you know, do we think we can do anything about that? Is there any engineering or like, you know, legal policy that we can do to change that? How is that going to affect our legal obligations to let water flow down the hill in the Colorado River Compact? So students can engage in those inquiry practices. And there may not be a singular answer. That is actually part of climate change education because it's part of the world we're currently facing, that answers have to be emerging and there might be 3 or 4 different options and we have to weigh them. So it allows students an opportunity to do that. We could also take things like groundwater. If we're in the Great Plains region, we might look at groundwater. We could think about NASA studies showing global groundwater depletion. This study involved work in the US, I think it was in Arizona, and really looking at some of those big aquifers and what's the implication for water and for urban planning as we go forward. So where is all this water coming from in arid regions where you're not going to get it out of the atmosphere? If it's coming out of the ground and the ground has a finite date on how much water we can remove, what's going to happen to those places? Do we need to think about capping populations in particular locations, about shifting water storage, about like what choices does that give us? What justice issues are involved in those questions? We might think about things like drought monitoring. What does it look like when there's drought? Who gets water and who doesn't? All right. Which regions of the country are water rich or water poor? How does that affect who lives there? And the resilience or risk factor for people in particular heat events. This is data actually from yesterday. So, you know, just the other day. So you can get time sequence data to look at how this changes over time. And you can pull whole files. So you could work with high school students and they could actually look at the raw data. Or you could work with middle school students and you could give them 3 or 4 examples of this. Okay? This one's dear to me. This is the tar sands of Canada. I'm Canadian. The tar sands are an indigenous, like many issues, but this one is pretty explicitly an indigenous rights issue about water, about clean and healthy water, and water not just for humans, but water for the world, for the environment, and how that water is being poisoned by different tailings ponds and tar filtration like efforts that are going on in the mining of oil out of the tar sands. And so in this one, you could talk about, you know, what is this leave it in the ground? You could work in social studies in this area and talk about the Leave It in the Ground campaign that Indigenous nations are you know, forwarding and advocating for. How can we possibly leave it in the ground? What alternatives for energy? You know, it raises a whole series of energy questions. All of these examples that I'm providing you, you can see that they're very integrated. You're talking about socio-political, scientific information, and it's all woven together in the learning. The last example here is around flooding. So this is a flood and drought map for the US. Again, this is sort of secondary data off of data that's collected around the US. And it looks like it allows for sort of a Likert scale, so to speak, of significant decrease versus significant increase in flooding. So you can look at areas where there's becoming less water over time and areas where there's more water over time. And you can look across time. So you can say, is flooding happening at different moments? Do we have to plan for that in our engineering? Do we have to think about that? I was in Boulder during the 2013 floods, and it was devastating. Flash floods down through Boulder ripped apart the streets, killed a number of people. And just thinking about who lives in flood zones, you know, can they even get insurance? You know, how does that impact their future, their ability to be resilient in the face of changing climate impacts? So a simple question like, how does your water impact you, really can be changed to be, how does your water impact your community? So you're thinking beyond just the individual into community. You're building those relationships, those responsibilities, the collective action move that we really need to do in our learning systems. One of the things that the anxiety and grief literature shows us in climate is that when people feel isolated and alone, when they feel that they individually are the ones who have to act, that is grief-inducing and despair-inducing. When you know that there are others working the problem with you, when you can engage in collective action, that is empowering and inspiring. So you really want to provide those connections for people to collective action spaces. Yes, you as an individual need to step into the collective space, but there is collective action to be had in the world, and you can start it too. So when you're thinking about why are you teaching, you also have to ask, how are you teaching? You have to think about how are you supporting teaching? So we're not talking about teaching as a singular act by an educator in a classroom. Education is a community of educators working with administrators, working with community members, with youth, with Indigenous and tribal partners to think about learning in place, in context, working with government to think about how do we foster, career trajectories for folks into different spaces. At the Institute for Science and Math Education, we've been building resources in climate probably for 10 years, 8 years or 10 years, but more intensely in the last 6 years. And we have a whole learning portal just for climate learning now. It might actually move to its own website called Climate Teacher Tools. But right now it's a tab on the STEM teaching tools space. And we're providing resources that are specifically designed around questions of practice that people are hitting as they're trying to teach climate change. So we work with a lot of different folks all across the nation, and they're asking these types of questions and co-designing solutions with us that we then write and share with other educators. We have a significant amount of traffic on these tools, and they're used in professional learning in all different pre-service and in-service learning for educators. We're also starting to use them internationally in different ways. I also have to share the lovely network in Washington State that is like my favorite deep collaboration. I've been involved in the Climb Time effort since it began, 2018. It is a Washington State legislatively funded effort to provide professional learning for educators on NGSS, which is the Next Generation Science Standards, including climate science. So the proviso that initiated that by the government did not say climate science alone. But within the first 6 months, we branded it Climb Time, and we moved on. And really, across the network, people really wanted to dive into that climate science space because it was so badly needed. It was being asked for. Educators wanted to understand how to support in that space. And so, like Gonzaga is a partner in that effort, there are many other partners across the nation. So these are portraits of different projects. The one on the far side, Network Design and Support, is about the network itself, the overarching network. All right. There has been other actors also supporting resources in the space. CLEAN, which is the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, has been working for decades. It was a NOAA-funded effort, and I have been in collaboration with them since 2009, I think it is, and building co-generating resources with other partners that we have across the nation. So most recently, I think the newest thing on there is we have resources for elementary educators to learn climate science. So resources for them to understand what climate science is, because they're generalists and they're scared if they don't understand the science. The Smithsonian's also working in this space. They took a sustainability lens. They went with those 17 sustainability goals as their framework, and they started building out what they call community resource guides. They decided not to go for teacher guides because they understand, like we do, that learning around climate is community-based learning. We might start with K-12's system, but this is how we build community-based learning. There's a school in every community. And so they started with community resource guides, and they picked topics. So there's a number of different topics And climate action is one of the topics, but climate is woven into everything else. They chose this particular direction because in about a third of the states across the nation, you cannot say the words climate change in your resources. Otherwise, you might get disciplined as an educator, okay, or have parents come and cause challenges for you. So you have to be able to be adaptive as a resource creator to be able to support people where they're at and support communities where they're at. It's not important to stand on a hill and say we have to say these words. What's important is that we take actions that change our future. The last resource group that I'll name here today before I wrap up is the Subject to Climate group. I've been following this group for a few years and just recently I engaged in a collaboration with them because they're in collaborations with most of my partners. And I was like, how do we not know each other? And so they provide a number of different resources, kind of like a hub of different resources coming in from all sorts of resource creators. And one of the things that I think they're doing exceptionally well is they're providing context-specific hubs. So for instance, New Jersey, as a state, had in a couple years back now, I can't remember the exact year, 2020-ish, created standards, climate change education standards for all grades, all subjects, and didn't know how to really implement that, just had these standards. And so they have built a hub in collaboration with Subject to Climate that provides, it draws from the federal databases on water, on energy, on all these different types of databases out there, and pulls in New Jersey-specific examples, and then helps teachers in those spaces do professional learning around the resources and customize curriculum to use local New Jersey data. Data and case studies and examples. They're expanding to include justice partners as well. So back to our little plant of some kind. I feel like this is some kind of interesting plant. So when we think about climate justice education, those petals actually extend out at multiple scales. They're true inside the classroom. They're equally true when we think about professional learning for educators. They also need this learning because they did not have climate change education when they were going to school. We also need it for leaders. We need it for philanthropic leaders. We need it for policy leaders. We need it for governors, okay? Everybody in those circles as we go outward needs the learning that is in that inner diagram. And so you can see the problem becomes much bigger once you start to back out and look at the whole system. A number of people have been writing books and providing resources about that inner circle, classroom, teachers, student-facing learning. Much fewer examples are found as you go outward because it's harder to do that type of research. It's starting to be there, but it's harder. Capacity building within and across the system, we are starting to get some examples of that. Folks like the Clean Network, the Office for Climate Education, Subject to Climate's even weighing in on some research pieces. All of that, people are starting to design research. The challenge, which we talked about here in my time at Gonzaga, the primary challenge with that is everybody's rushing to implement and nobody's funding the research. So when we look at who can fund this research, it's all over the place because climate science is all over the place. So is it the National Science Foundation? Is it philanthropic organizations? You know, where do we find the people who are actually going to fund this research? So that's a challenge we're working on. And then if we back out even one more step to the international pieces around climate change learning, broadly speaking, when we're not just talking about K-12 education, education's only one part of a system of climate empowerment that we need to engage. There are folks now in Germany working on something called the ACE Observatory, so the Action for Climate Empowerment Observatory, that are starting to synthesize and provide more research and hubs around this effort. So as we start to think about what climate change education looks like in America, we have to think about all these different pieces, okay? And we have to kind of hang ourselves on one piece and dive into it deeply so we can make some headway. Much of the work that I've been doing is around collaboration and thinking about collaboration and justice. I deeply believe that a sustainable future is not possible unless we have justice at the core. And a lot of the work that we see in the justice community for naming the specific examples where that is happening help support that belief that I have. This resource provides, there's an article attached to it, this resource provides some principles to help us work through our own upbringings, for lack of a better way to say it, so our own challenges that we may have for engaging in justice work. Because even though I've been working in justice for a long time, I have so much to learn. And so we always have to be in that stance of humility as we engage in that work. I'm never going to be done that journey. There's always going to be something new that I have to learn in collaboration with a new partner in a new context. And so these provide some guidance for how we might think about our engagement, where we might see the challenges that we're facing. So when you're thinking again about that question, why are you teaching? My answer to that question is I'm teaching climate change learning. I'm actually teaching systems of climate change learning because I want to foster just climate action. I'm not teaching just so that you know it. I'm teaching so you go and do it, okay? And I want you to be supported in that doing. So when we think about the future of climate change education in America, I read that question as the US, even though I am a dual citizen of US and Canada. So I would ask us to also think that America is incredibly privileged in the world. We have amazing university systems and resources and intellectual capacity here. And that intellectual capacity is in other places, but the resources to exert it are often very incoherent. So we need to think about how we build beyond just the US. I don't see country lines on this image, okay? We are a unified system. So how are we thinking about the future of climate change in North America and the Pacific, our near neighbors? What are we thinking about the future of climate change in the Arctic, right? How are we understanding the Inuit and the Dene and how their knowledge systems and their experience to adaptation come into play? How are we thinking about it in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia? We had just 2 weeks ago the passing of Dr. Salim Huq, who was one of the leading climate justice experts globally. And he, with almost no resources, led the ICAD network across Southeast Asia and helped foster community climate resilience in Bangladesh and all that region. Like Bangladesh. And the US, struggles to engage in this. And he did that for more than 20 years. How are we thinking about the future of climate change education in Latin America and Africa? I spent time with colleagues recently we were in Paris, but they were from Colombia, and they're fostering this entire network between all of the Latin American countries in Spanish around climate learning resources. Do you think that we could use some of those resources? We don't have to create new things in Spanish. We can create partnerships with people who are already creating resources in Spanish. So when we think about the future of climate change education, I want us to think about the future of climate change learning to foster just climate action globally, now and for the future. And I just again want to say thank you so much for having me here, and to call out my colleagues who really have contributed to this group think in the space. And another colleague of mine who is not at the Institute for Science and Math Education, but who I've partnered with deeply for a decade plus, Frank Neopold, who's the head climate change educator for NOAA. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. That was fantastic. So as you're thinking about your questions, also you're welcome to email me at climateinstitute@gonzaga.edu if you're at home online and would like to send in a question. So as you're thinking about your question, and I may call on one of our climate literacy fellows just to warn you, the the first question I had was if you could use a magic wand and change one thing, what would be what for you the most impactful sort of one thing that would help achieve what you've talked about tonight?
I would send every current decision maker to school. So I would create climate learning opportunities for current decision makers to understand this kind of complexity of the decision-making space, particularly around justice issues, because that is the area that we have just struggled to have folks in the sciences especially, and I am an environmental and ecological scientist, but to have that understanding. So different people require different knowledge, but I think leaders generally require a lot of new learning.
Excellent. Questions from the audience? Yeah. If you could just say your name and major, maybe.
My name is Olivia. I'm a senior biology and environmental studies major. And my question is, what do you believe is the best strategy for reaching and educating older community members that may be outside of the school system and are a little bit more like isolated?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Often when we talk about intergenerational learning, people assume a unidirectional nature to that older people teach younger people. That's not true at all. When you create intergenerational learning experiences, everyone learns in those situations. So the best thing that we can do is to create those situations in every way possible, because older folks do want to know this. They didn't get this type of education. They still read the news and are worried, and often for their kids and their grandkids. So I strongly believe that if we can create vertical mentoring programs in different ways, that mentors everyone in those relationships, not just the youth.
Thanks, Olivia. Others? Questions? Go to Grace. Name and major.
Hi, my name is Grace Fletcher. I'm an environmental studies major, and I'm also one of the climate literacy fellows at the center. My question is that given that marginalized communities are the most impacted by climate change and therefore need the most climate education, but also schools that are located in marginalized communities often are the most underfunded and the teachers are the most overworked, how do you recommend that we mend that gap?
A couple things. First, I wouldn't make the assumption that they need the most climate learning. Often communities who are living in poverty are the most versatile because they've had to deal with climate impacts for decades. Frontline communities globally. So they have a lot of knowledge to share with us. And actually that's an argument that the Global South is generally making to the Global North, is that they don't need people to come and tell them what to do. They need people to come and collaborate with them and share learning. Because in the US, we're actually deeply needing that type of resilience learning in the face of trauma. Having said that, there is a lot of learning that can go in all directions. One of the things with schools, there is some work now in the Infrastructure Act and in subsequent work around shifting the physical structures of schools in ways to make them community resilience hubs. So for heat events or cold events, to make them actually, because there is a school in every community, so to make them climate resilient spaces. That is sort of flies in the face a bit of the funding model for education that the US has, which is very local controlled and has the problem that you named, which if it's local controlled, often that tax base is gerrymandered in a way to make poor schools poor and rich schools richer. So some of that federal funding is available to be able to offset that problem. Having said that, there is, it's going to be a continuing challenge unless we change the structure of funding for schools, which is so deep in the fabric of the United States. I'm not sure how that would ever be changed. So we'll have to kind of rely on those federal or state funding efforts to offset those inequities. You will start to see that more because the impacts are significant. One of the places I've seen that most innovatively is the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which it wasn't government money, it was business money. So if you're a business in the city of Portland and you make over a certain amount, you pour money in by a percentage into this fund. The fund is administered by communities of color, indigenous communities in a collaborative to actually do infrastructure improvement and climate resilience. that's brilliant. So, yeah.
Next question over here.
Hi, my name is Dean. I'm a AmeriCorps Fellow here at the Climate Institute. So one aspect of your work I found particularly interesting is bringing climate education to communities that might normally be hostile to any mention of, climate change or ideas that they may see as like liberal. So where my question lies is, where does capitalism fit into your vision of climate justice education, and how do you balance the obvious hostility to the relationship between our economy and exploitation of the earth?
Yeah, the best resource that I linked to in the slides is from the Climate Justice Alliance. They have a just transition model and principles of just transition that I think are very reasonable and well-grounded in research. The idea of expansion economics is, really? We have a finite planet. It worked for a colonial era. It's not going to work us into the future. It's just, we can see, we live on a ball. So we do need to, all that's going to do is reify who has money and who doesn't. That's what's going to happen. So economics are fundamentally part of climate learning. Having said that, it is not helpful to, from a learning perspective, it is not helpful to be like, you're wrong, and start there, right? That is not a helpful stance. And nobody is completely wrong or completely right in anything, right? So you have to figure out where people care in their daily lives and understand the things that are most deeply connected to what they care about, and start there. The best example I have of this was it was the USDA, so the Department of Agriculture. You can imagine they deal with a lot of very conservative communities, and they wanted to talk climate change in a rural community in Oregon. Oregon is not as liberal as many people think it is. Just the urban centers are quite liberal. And so what they did is they took a giant barbecue trailer, and they cooked brisket in the town square. And they put up a sign, say, come and chat with us and have lunch. And they cooked brisket all morning, into the evening. And then by the evening, word had got around in the community that there was brisket to be had. And so they did this community effort of just sitting and talking about what people cared about and working with them to talk about that. It's not critical that everyone start the conversation by admitting that the climate change is happening. While that would actually soothe my soul if everybody could do that, it's not critical to actually engage in climate action. So you can have folks like that engaging in regenerative agriculture practices, and they know that there's something wrong. They understand water, right? And so you just can start in a different place. And those relationships, as you build them over time, you will eventually build yourself into a space where people will talk about more testy issues because they feel trust. You're a trusted messenger with them. Yeah.
I've been focusing on this side of the room. I realized I'd give the other side a chance in case there was a hand over there that I missed. All right? Okay. Go to get it.
Hi, my name is Abby, and I'm an environmental studies and communication student here at Gonzaga. And so my question is, I guess I kind of have two questions, but they could be merged together. In areas that are really focusing on climate justice and climate action teaching, and then there's some areas that you mentioned aren't, is there any ideas or thoughts that you have on how we bridge that gap so we don't just keep getting these extremes of groups of people who know a lot about climate change and how to combat it, and then a lot of people who don't?
Yes, and actually, so a couple years ago, I was involved with some just amazing folks in the justice community and in the communications community. So Dr. Ed Maybeck at George Mason University, who is the Climate Change Communications, Center for Climate Change Communications, and Dr. Robert Bullard at Texas Southern University, and Dr. Beverly Wright, part of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and a number of other scholars closely. And one of the things that we wrote a proposal for and lobbied the federal government, that was a new one for me, lobbied the federal government for was something called, at the time we called it the Climate Justice Solutions Network. And we worked with every region of the country to define that. The issues were wildly different in different regions, but we came to an agreement about what shared language would look like and how we might build focal sort of hubs and nexus points to be able to have people come into relation in regional context and build that knowledge and shared purpose and shared work together, because it's in the shared work at a smaller local context that our values and our ability to work through those challenges happens. When we talk at the national rhetoric level, it becomes very polarizing and is not helpful. So like trying to figure out how to do that work in areas where you're actually deeply connected, that's the scale of that is somewhere between 10,000 and 1 million people. If you can build networks that are in that range, it was a paper done called The Powers of 10. That's the sort of scale that's most effective. Anyway, so we produced this request. That is now the environmental justice arm of the EPA's Thriving Community Tic Tac Centers. So it got funded. And, but that effort is still very, very new. It's like just budding. And so fostering it in a way to actually make it what we thought it could be, and to build those types of relationships in communication, social sciences, justice communities in relationship with each other, that's what we really need. Yeah.
I want to build on a question, kind of the version of the last two questions. We had Dr. Naomi Oreskes from Harvard for a talk in July, and she was talking about her new book, The Big Myth, which was building on the work from Merchants of Doubt. And I'm thinking about the fact that we have some, very entrenched, well-funded interests who aren't interested in sort of going away quietly. And we've talked about before, for example, the work of the Heartland Institute, which takes government reports and IPCC reports and then sort of deconstructs them into their own sort of narrative and then packages them into curricular resources and then sends them to districts all over the country, and teachers and principals get these materials and think they should be maybe using them to in the classroom. And so I'm just curious whether you feel like that is something that will, it's happening. I'm just wondering how much you think it's really potent, or really it's just sort of like a dying trend. Is that sort of the last gasps, or is that really the front?
Yeah, I would like to say it's a dying trend, but a lot of that work started, I would say, around 2000, 2001, right, when the rhetoric politically changed nationally. And the other thing you saw occurring at the same time as the Heartland Institute, the Discovery Institute, various folks in that kind of space, was that they, I think it was the Discovery Institute, started a huge advocacy and lobbying effort to get, what do they call them, teaching accountability or something like that. There were these acts that moved around in different states, Tennessee, Louisiana, various states enacted them. Colorado only lost by 1 vote, didn't enact it. And basically it was climate change, evolution, cloning, biological and chemical evolution, it said, whatever that is. And they were trying to get all sides of the issue taught. And so, and it was like, what do you mean all sides of the issue? What does that mean? And so it opened the door for intelligent design in schools, for a number of different trends in science classrooms that were not in alignment with the national science standards at the time and the NGSS later. So I would say there's iterations of that strategy. The 15,000 teachers that got copies of the Heartland climate change education resources, it was a thing. We had to deal with it. And so there are networks of science learning networks across, like at different scales of the systems, and everyone was activated at that moment to try and deal with that issue and make people aware that those resources were not coming from climate science sources. They actually took NOAA resources too, and partially told the story, like cherry-picked different data to tell a particular narrative. And so, you know, Frank Neopold got involved in it, and the National Center for Science Education got involved in it. And so a lot of people like worked, and they're all still in relationship with each other. We sit on a national committee together, all of us. And so whenever that kind of thing happens, we're like, so usually within like 2 hours of some kind of email going out or some kind of resource, everyone knows. So we're pretty on it.
Last thing, because I can't let us end on that negative note.
There's so many positive things.
The work that you're focusing on that is really inspirational and interesting. And one of the things I'd just give you an opportunity to repeat, because you did hit it really nicely, was creating forms of agency for young people as sort of a response or an antidote to the eco-anxiety and the despair. And so one of the things I really enjoy about our Climb Time network in Washington State and the work that you do is this idea that it's just not about simply educating about climate science and knowing the facts, and that it's about so much more. And I think that's come across really well. But it's just this hope-filled, inspirational, sort of activating orientation that I think young people find so much more interesting and hope-filled anyway. So I just want to give you one more chance to sort of hit that.
Yeah, I really, you know, the Climb Time Network has been the source of many of the STEM teaching tools in this area. So folks like Pacific Educational Institute there worked on the tool around solution-centered teaching. We had many people at Islandwood and EarthGen and others in different ESDs across the state work on a tool around action-oriented climate science learning. And these resources can go across science, social science, elementary, arts, like they can move in different kind of learning contexts. And they are. The Climb Time is not just science teachers. All sorts of people wander in the door and are welcomed in the door. So really trying to think about how we can even foster more innovative ways to engage and meet youth where they're at with the types of learning they want to do. Think about the community engagement, that intergenerational component a little more deeply. Dr. Bang and her colleagues have written a couple STEM teaching tools to help resource that type of work from the Learning in Places work. So really, I just feel like so privileged to be involved with all these folks who are deeply implementing the work and just like dream up new things to do, which I think we're starting to do with you guys now too.
We are. Just to end on that note, I'm really would be remiss if I didn't point out that Gonzaga and the Climate Institute is involved in what we call the Climate Literacy Project, which takes a couple of different forms. One of them is that we hire Gonzaga undergraduates, and some of them have been asking questions tonight, who go into K-8 classrooms and deliver really hands-on climate education lessons, and it's a really impactful for our students, so Gonzaga students, and then of course for young people who are learning from college students. It's a really cool program. We also, with my colleague Carly Holbein and I, deliver professional learning opportunities along with colleagues from, again, across the state. Supported by this Climb Time program, and have reached many teachers across the state who are interested in learning about how to incorporate climate science and climate education into their own practice at every level. And it's just been really impactful.
I'm going to add one thing because Carly told me all about that project more deeply today. And so back to that intergenerational question. So while undergraduate students and youth are learning, educators are learning as well. So educators who, because they are being able to see climate lessons that are innovative taught with their students in their classroom contexts and see what learning could look like in those contexts. So that's the type of intergenerational mentoring that's just wonderful. Want to add to that?
Hi, I got pulled up with very little context, but yeah, we're really happy and proud to be doing this work here in Spokane and Eastern Washington and sort of starting to lead the way in this community in talking about climate change and how we talk to kids about climate change. And another thing we're really excited about is not only are we working directly with K-12 students and K-12 teachers, is we're developing partnerships at administrator levels. And so working with folks at the districts who are interested in thinking about how we can do this more systemically and starting to pull in parents and trusted community messengers into the classroom to talk about climate change with young people. And so doing all this interesting matrixed learning has been a really great learning opportunity.
So if you're a student out there and you're interested, it is a job that you could do as for a year or for several years if you're interested. So definitely hit us up if you're interested. Let's thank Dr. Morrison for her talk. You can find this on our YouTube channel, so please look for opportunities to share it with others who might be interested. Thanks for coming. We hope to see you again in 2 weeks, where we'll have another great panel, our last for this semester. Thanks for coming. We hope to see you again soon.